Hi everyone, thanks for coming tonight. My name is Gavin Browning. I'm the Director of Events and Public Programs here at GSAPP, and welcome to the third event of the fall semester. As always, I encourage you to use this hashtag, wood91911. They always correspond to the date of the events, and you can kind of comment on the event as it's happening on whatever social media you use. Sorry, no pressure.
As long as it's nice.
As long as it's nice. And you guys are welcome to do that too. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Tobias Armborst, Daniel Dioka, and Georgeen Theodore of the Brooklyn-based firm Interboro Partners. You may know them from their many interesting curatorial and built projects, including a new and temporary public space in Tribeca called Lent Space, which I believe opened in 2009, is that right? Mm-hmm. And most recently, Holding Pattern, their winning entry to the 2011 MoMA and PS1 Young Architects Program in the courtyard of PS1 in Long Island City, Queens, which we'll hear more about tonight. Interboro, they were also the sub-curators of the 2009 International Architecture Biennial Rotterdam from the US. And the theme of this biennial was Open City, Designing Coexistence. And for it, they created something that I really love called the Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, which is a dictionary of 101 things that open or close the city. It was an installation, and these 101 items included entries on a spectrum of things on how people interact, from overt weapons of segregation, such as racial covenants, to overt tools of openness, such as inclusionary zoning and community benefits agreements, and also kind of less intuitive things like designated smoking areas, Halloween, pool sheds, fences, and other things that can be co-opted by architecture to open the city. And I just want to read a quick statement about this project from something that they wrote about the Arsenal. It goes like this. Our research suggests that while large-scale suburbanization does indeed pose challenges to the ideal of the open city, it also offers opportunities. Jane Jacobs's celebrated generators of diversity may not have much relevance in an environment where mixed primary use, small blocks, aged buildings, and concentration are few and far between. But we wonder whether there might be other, less tried and true means of bringing about more openness in the built environment. What if architects and planners reframe the open city as something simpler, lighter, and more everyday? And I think that their exhibition, or their installation Holding Pattern, is a great example of this. It was built with direct community input from people who live and work around the museum in Queens, and it also included those people in the process of creating it before and during and after. And it actually closes tomorrow, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen it throughout the summer or during the popular warm-up event on Saturdays. So we'll hear about that, and that will be followed by an interview by Christopher Barley and Troy Therrien of the firm They, which is a curatorial and design practice for strategic vision, information architecture, and knowledge production. Both Christopher and Troy received their MArcs in 2009 from GSAPP, which is also the year that they curated a show at PS1 called GSAPP 10th Anniversary Review, GSAPP being Young Architects Program, for which they interviewed architects, museum directors, and curators who were involved in the decade of architectural experimentation in the courtyard of PS1. And they also created an archive of images and an oral history, which they're continuing to work on tonight. So we'll hear from Interboro, and then there will be a live interview by Christopher and Troy about Holding Pattern, and that will become part of that growing archive. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Interboro. Thanks.
Oh yeah. Otherwise, does the keyboard work?
The keyboard works, yeah.
Okay.
You move ahead.
Okay. Cool.
I'll go.
That's great. Hi. It's very nice to be here. We'd like to start by thanking Gavin Browning for the kind invitation to come here and talk to you today about our work. We're honored to be part of this lecture series and to be part of this very interesting oral history project. So Gavin asked us to talk about a few projects on this theme of a design deferred. We're going to talk about three. One is very old, one is aging, and the third is quite new. But they are, as Gavin correctly pointed out, part of a trajectory, I think, in our work. So we're going to talk for about 40, 45 minutes, and then we're going to have the interview. So let's first tell you a little bit about Interboro partners. Thanks. So Interboro is myself, Georgeen, Theodore, Tobias Armborst. Interboro is 9 years old. We met at the GSD where Georgeen and Tobias were studying urban design, and I was studying urban planning. We called ourselves Interboro mostly because it's a very ubiquitous, very everyday name in New York City. If you look, if you go to the phone book and look up Interboro, you find like 1 million hits. Although who looks in the phone book anymore? Anyway, there's lots of Interboros, and we kind of, but there was no Interboro architecture, so we thought we should step up to the plate. So we like that kind of everydayness and anonymity. And like the name Interboro, our firm Interboro does quite a wide variety of things. We work on a variety of project types with a variety of clients and a range of deliverables. We are, as Columbia might say, expanded architects. So, for example, we curate stuff. We do a lot of interactive design, web essays, and we do neighborhood master plans. We do feasibility studies for developers, and we do panels and workshops, and we're going to talk about this project. We design public spaces as well. Doing a research project now about the phenomenon of naturally occurring retirement communities in New York City, we're very excited about. So despite all this variety, there are certain constants, and two such contents that are perhaps most relevant to today's talk. Number one, we always are very interested in how people use and transform places every day. How the meaning and sometimes the form of a place or a building is changed over time by people or forces that are typically beyond the control of the architect. Sometimes we simply document and visualize such everyday transformations. Sometimes we use what we find as raw material for our design work. And in our design work, we strive to create places that are ambiguous enough to be appropriated and transformed in many ways. We strive to create what Barry Bergdahl has called public rec rooms, places that are informal enough for people to casually use and make their own. Two, we're interested in social justice in the city, for lack of a better phrase. And Gavin mentioned a project that we curated that's on its way to becoming a book. The project is called The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. And as Gavin mentioned, it's sort of a dictionary of 101 weapons that either bring people together or keep people apart. And this is a mural of all 101 things in operation in this crazy fantasy landscape of beaches and gated communities and things. And somewhere in there are all 101. This book actually started with with an exhibition. As Gavin mentioned, we were asked to curate the American wing of the 2009 International Architecture Biennial Rotterdam, and the theme, as Gavin mentioned, was open city design and coexistence. What does that mean? Well, it's similar to what we mean when we say open housing. People should be able to live where they please. There shouldn't be barriers to access in the form of, say, housing discrimination or exclusionary zoning. And this is important for two reasons. First, since we live in a country where opportunity is so unevenly distributed around our metropolitan areas, restricting access to places, closing off certain parts of our metropolitan areas, amounts to restricting access to the goodies, things like health, wealth, and education. To take an extreme example, here's an article about how in Baltimore there's a 20-year life expectancy difference between the poorest neighborhood and the richest neighborhood. So if people have a right to health, they should probably have a right to the neighborhoods where health accrues, but they don't. Not always. Second, though, restricting access to space undermines what's great about a city, namely heterogeneity and encounters with the unfamiliar. We made, for this exhibition, we made 3 installations, one on this theme of the open city, encyclopedia of 101 things that restrict or foster access to space, a mural that looks at radically homogeneous communities in America, and collection of best practices for making more open cities. The encyclopedia, things that restrict or foster access, we call the arsenal of exclusion and inclusion, and that's the project that Gavin talked about and that I'm talking about now. So here they are, all 101 of them listed, so for the installation we made this, and for the book, it's now being turned into a book, we made this list. And we invited scholars, architects, artists, attorneys to do little pieces, short text, photo essays on them. It looks like this. There's a Leporello-style text images above. Fast forward a couple years, it's being turned into a book. The weapons are all on things, they're all according to Tour 1. You want to understand why America is so racially segregated, things of restrictive covenants and eminent domain, mortgage discrimination, neighborhood associations, racial steering, quite depressing. Tour number 2, you want to understand why segregation persists 40 years after the Fair Housing Act. So here we have things like exclusionary amenities, where a developer will put a gigantic church in the middle of a development and say, oh, anyone can live in this community, but if you live here, you have to pay $150 a month to maintain this church. The net result, only Catholics live in this community, which was the developer's intent all along. It's called Ave Maria. But this is also true sometimes for mosques, prayer speakers, automatic elevators, golf courses, these kind of legal ways to create segregation without violating the Fair Housing Act. There's also essays on the staples of defensible urbanism, things like armrests on benches. And in Tour 4, we get into things that open the city. And we're interested in things that don't, are sometimes out of the control of architects and planners. Halloween, when just for a day, all the neighborhood boundaries and private and public boundaries just kind of go away for one day. We're interested, and of course we're interested in the so-called strong tactics of the week, planning policies, housing vouchers, community benefit agreements, public housing, and so on and so forth. We're also interested in, and in part of the book is architectural projects that in one way or another open the city. It's a wonderful project by the Los Angeles Urban Rangers, Malibu Public Beaches. They give people these maps and take people on tours and explain how to legally occupy private beaches, which actually aren't private after all. There's all kind of loopholes for occupying them. Here's a shot of that installation. Just some shots of the book, which should come out soon. And again, this mural that hopefully will grace the inside of this book.
So Dan mentioned that we sort of have two large areas of interest. One, broadly speaking, social justice in the city. The other is transformation, everyday transformation of spaces. And the second project we want to show you is one that deals with those transformation. It's old. It's embarrassingly old, but it's kind of important. We decided to show it here because it really leads into a holding pattern, which we'll show later, and which the discussion will be about. The project is called In the Meantime, Life with Land Banking, and it's dealing with a dead shopping mall. It's dealing with the fate of a dead shopping mall in Dutchess County. It's the Dutchess Mall in Fishkill, New York. It was built in 1974 with this sort of dumbbell structure that is typical for malls of that generation. You see these two anchor stores. It's a very large building, as you see when you overlay the building plus its parking lot over the Manhattan grid. But it was never really successful for a number of reasons. So, which had to do with the micro-location of this mall in relation to a highway exit. And so it kind of floundered for a while and then closed its doors in the 1990s. When we entered the picture in early 2004, the owners of this building, New York City-based developers, freely admitted that they were land banking, meaning they claimed the property for tax purposes, but as a write-off, and they were fine with just waiting and just having this sit there and not doing anything, which was okay for them. It was sort of obviously perceived as a problem for the community to have this very large, prominent site sit there, dead, nothing happening with it. But when we started looking at this property, we decided not to be critical of land banking, but accept it as an opportunity, right? To look at this sort of period of nothing happening as a time where other things, the space can be the temporary location for other unplanned programs to take place in the meantime. In fact, hanging out there a lot in the parking lot of this mall, we soon found that already there were a lot of things, unplanned things happening there, like this bus service serving the supposedly dead mall, somebody waiting for a bus here, right? Another bus stop that also doubled as a dry cleaning business, you know, toilets in the parking lot, RVs, rigs, homes, other miscellaneous activities going on. And then this guy who was in sort of mysteriously riding around his golf cart picking up trash. You know, there goes a hot dog truck. And then on the weekend there was this amazing flea market going on in the parking lot, but then also in the you know, repurposed anchor store here. This is the KISS memorabilia stand that you see there. We started mapping all these activities that we found there, and then diagrammed the different rhythms of the mall, starting with the picture of health when this thing was fully operational. You see a pretty good, you know, even heartbeat there on the echocardiogram. Then we mapped current programs, pretty weak pulse, just very few businesses left. And then we looked at the temporary programs, this flea market, and you see how it picks up there on the weekend. Then we also mapped the illicit and illegal programs that were going on here, and you see there's no telling when they occur. So this is total arrhythmia that you see there in the echocardiogram. We, after looking at this from afar, we identified people, constituents, local constituents, people that use the space, have some sort of interest in it, like this guy who runs the hot dog stand. He notes that the mall parking lot had become, you know, a sort of makeshift truck stop. So truckers pulled in there and spent the night there, so he set up his little hot dog business to sell them food. So he started a little business out of the conditions. So we talked to him. We talked to to a lot of different people, both on-site and off-site, you know, like the developers, different interest groups, and so on. So because this was really not so much about just romanticizing the, you know, everyday practices, not to only have this dissectorian view of the place, but really understand all the actors that act on this side to get a full picture of who's a player here, either on the larger scale or the smaller scale. We really saw this as a kind of good thorough detective work, right? Interviewing people, but also just listening, hanging around, looking for clues, and suspending judgment as long as possible to understand sort of to get some sighted knowledge, to understand the site. And then we used this local knowledge to develop a design proposal, which I'm not going to go through too much. Just sort of the story is the big shopping program has moved out, and now, as you saw, all sorts of other activities have moved in, and we tried to, you know, follow that logic and started proposing all kinds of new interventions that could make some sort of limited sense here, instead of designing an overall plan, right? So this is the opposite of master planning. It's not like a big picture idea, the big party, and the details are derived from that, but it's throwing ideas that make some sort of sense on the place up to a point where you know, a critical mass emerges, a degree of urbanity emerges. I'm not going to walk you through them. There are a lot of these proposals. Some of them are really very short-term, cheap interventions to help this use during this temporary phase, the land banking phase, like these basically office infrastructure for small businesses to colonize the structure, the mall structure from outside in. We saw there was a graphic design business that started doing that, and we thought this would be actually very useful, very cheap intervention to help that kind of colonization of the structure from outside in. So cheap stuff that, you know, tries to intensify existing dynamics to get some sort of use out of it. There were other proposals that were just, you know, capitalizing on the temporary mess or exploit this temporary mess like a nightclub and things of that sort that just took advantage of the fact that there are no neighbors around here. And then a third group of proposals that were building on this sort of casual, mainly car-oriented community uses around there. You know, there's an existing drive-through McDonald's, an existing drive-through bank, and so on. And so we added, enriched these kind of everyday programs. But again, many of those proposals were designed for the limited period of land banking, a couple of years. And our thesis was really here that this sort of an in-between time like this sometimes allows programs to happen, but also buildings to happen that otherwise might not have a chance, right? Under normal conditions, these things might never happen. And these things that happen in the meantime can also disappear after the lab phase is over, so to say, but they can also influence what happens after this experimental site, right? They sort of can change the DNA of a site. And so from there, we move to the next project with that thought in mind.
Thank you. So the next project is Lent Space. It's the temporary sculpture park in Soho that Gavin mentioned earlier. And the site might be familiar to many of you because it's a full block, as you can see here, right on Canal Street, bounded by Canal Street, 6th Avenue, Varick, and Grand Street. It's very near to the entrance of the Holland Tunnel. And this aerial is actually a little bit older, and you can see in it there are two buildings here. And all these buildings were torn down in 2007. And the buildings were demolished because the landowner planned, or at least was planning in 2008, to build a large residential condominium tower here. And the landowner's problem was that the site was zoned for manufacturing. And so there had to be a change in zoning, which, as many of you probably know, in New York can be a very long and multi-year process. So while the process to change the zoning was underway, the landowner thought that sort of in the meantime, during this 3 to 5 year period, he might as well put some sculptures here and also incidentally get a tax break. So the landowner approached the LMCC, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, a downtown arts organization that's quite active in the city. Probably many of you are familiar with it. The LMCC runs a number of initiatives, including Swing Space, which was a program that temporarily matched artists in need of studio space with vacant office space in Lower Manhattan. So anyway, the LMCC curator, Adam Kleinman, a really brilliant guy, he wasn't too excited about the idea of like temporary decorating a development site. But nonetheless, one day he called us and he asked us to prepare an estimate for creating some gravel paths on the site to make it accessible. And we didn't give him a price for the gravel paths. Instead, we introduced him to our Dead Malls project, really to make the point that one could do so much more here than just putting down some gravel and a sculpture. Here was an opportunity to pull off an interesting sort of in the meantime, an interesting project in the meantime. Here was an opportunity to use a niche in time to introduce a project and a program that just wouldn't have a chance in this part of the city under the current conditions of ownership and with the current realities of land values. So as Tobias mentioned before, our Dead Mall project here really had a funny afterlife. Here our Dead Mall project really lived on in sort of theory and in practice. And here we sort of used an in-between time to incubate new programs and new forms of public space. So we somehow together turned this project into a temporary public space, plus performance space, plus sculpture park, plus tree nursery. Sounds a little complicated. So here's the site. Let's see, is this where I get the, yeah, okay. So next to the site here, you see this little, it's actually a plaza. It's called Juan Darte Square. It's named after the founder of the Dominican Republic. You do know that 6th Avenue is kind of Avenue of Americas. And in between, there's actually this little street that had recently been demapped when we started the project, meaning though that although it looked like a public street, it no longer was one. So it somehow actually belonged to the landowner. And we're still not entirely sure how you buy a public street in New York City, but it can be done. This is the Duarte Square here, and you can, if you look sort of closely past this fence, you can kind of see the old demapped street and the curb there. A problem that we encountered at the beginning of the design process was that the landowner insisted that the site had to be fenced in. This was basically a legal requirement related to the landowner's insurance. And while generally they were very, very open to our ideas, there was absolutely no question about whether or not to have a fence. And this was really a huge problem for us because, as you might imagine, if you have this sort of fairly small site and a few sculptures inside and then this like big fence around it, it seemed a little weird, like some kind of art zoo. And also, actually, the budget was such that a new fence would have actually killed most of our budget. So after fighting against the fence for a while, we actually decided to make it the most important element of the design and design a fence that would be sort of permeable and active, a center of activity rather than a border, an object that blurs the boundaries between inside and outside. So we decided to just keep the existing clearly provisional chain link construction fence on 3 sides, and then facing, as you can see sort of here, and then facing the sidewalk, we basically got rid of it on Duarte Square and the demapped street. And so on this side, we replaced the construction fence with a new element that is pulled back from the curb of the street to the old building line. And we constructed this new element out of marine grade plywood, a kind of material clearly different from the chain link and suggestive of furniture. And we made it operable. We made it possible for people to actually move the fence. So here you see the diagram. It's actually a little light. I hope you can read it. When the fence is closed. So again, sort of all 3 sides have that chain link fence, and then this wood wall is sort of facing the square as sort of as a kind of facade or as a billboard. One could say giving an address to the project, a street address on a demapped street. And here's the fence on an everyday basis. Some of the fence elements are open to allow these kinds of shortcuts through the site between some of the workplaces and subway stations and so on. And then here it is sort of with the entire side open, sort of blurring the boundary between the public space and the privately owned public space. And also creating a series of compartments, these kinds of little small gallery spaces. So here you can see it in action. We just opened one door. We actually made a bench on on one side of the fence, making the object a little more public in that it's no longer clearly identifiable as one thing, like is it a fence, is it a bench, but something that can really be used or appropriated in a number of different ways. So it could be used as a sort of a larger sitting space. You can also move them a little closer, or have the bench face inside or outside. That's Adam Kleiman, our client. Or open the whole thing up. You can see now when those doors are sort of perpendicular to you, it almost sort of dissolves and sort of disappears. In addition to being a fence, it can now create all kinds of social spaces for people to hang out and to sit and to play. And so here you can see it in the aerial photo, along with a sculpture by the artist Tobias Armborst. His piece is this series of chain link fences, almost like a sort of like onion skin that's peeled off of the outside fence. We sort of interwove our planters and planting with his piece. And then these boxes, they're actually a movable park and tree nursery. What we realized at the outset of the project, it was kind of clear to us that in order to create some use value for the many people who worked in this area, this place really needed some shade trees and generally some vegetation. But it seemed wrong to us to actually, as it was a temporary project, it seemed very wrong to us to plant trees and then after a couple of years just tear them out and sort of and throw them away when at that point when the trees would actually have grown and be big enough to sort of be nice and produce some nice effects. So we started working with a horticulturalist to see what would be the right way to plant trees. So we learned that if you want to plant trees and then move them after a couple of years, it turns out that planting them in boxes like this actually works best because the roots are confined. And then we got a couple of trees donated by the Parks Department. The Parks Department also taught tree planting workshops on this site as part of the so-called Million Trees campaign. And in addition, we tried to find ways to sort of densify the park by actually borrowing trees, by providing a tree nursery. So small trees were to grow on the site for a year and then be moved out to become street trees. And the idea of temporarily storing or borrowing trees really made a lot of sense to us, given the limited lifespan of the project. So actually, it's a strategy that we got really excited about, and we have continued to develop in other projects that we're going to talk about after this, and you'll see a little bit more of that later. So these are some images of the planting area with the different size planters. It's kind of set up like an abacus with these sort of parallel lines in one direction, and just makes it easier to sort of move the boxes in and out. And then they're sort of irregularly placed on the other axis, creating little clearings for sculptures and creating shortcuts. So here's one of those shortcuts connecting a subway entrance with the lobby of this office building on Barrack Street. Seating, like these chaise lounges and benches. There are little clearings for sculptures. And here it is in full bloom. When you move around in here, it's really, you really get this sort of constant change of perspective. You get this constant change of perspective of order and disorder.
Okay, so now we would like to talk to you about holding pattern, our PS1 project, MoMA PS1 project. Most of you probably know, for those of you who don't. Every year, MoMA PS1 commissions an architecture firm to design and build a setting for big Saturday afternoon parties called warm-ups. The program essentially provides seating and shade for the 6,000 or so visitors that come to these events every Saturday between June and October. You have to build everything yourself in 4 months. Actually, this would probably be a good time to point out that you're hearing from the 3 principles of Interboro here, but projects like holding pattern couldn't happen without a lot of help. We had an enormous team of amazing volunteers for holding pattern. We can't mention them all here, but we would like to acknowledge Rebecca Beyer, the project manager, Andrew Costello, Janessa Fry, Trevor Lamb, Kathleen Cahill, and our graphic designers, Thumb, structural engineers, Bureau Happold, and illustrator Lester Gonzalez. So back to holding pattern. It's a temporary project, and so here are the warm-up parties. I'm sure many of you have been to some of them. When we first started to think about what to do, we started to think, what happens to all this stuff when the project is over? Does it get thrown in the garbage? So our first thought was probably it makes some sense to recycle. Might there be a design? Could we design and build something that could be put to a different use once warm-up is over? Second thing that we thought about a lot was, PS1 is located in Queens, which is the most diverse, the most vibrant, the most exciting part of New York City, maybe one of the best places in the world, we would argue. And MoMA PS1 does a great job of doing outreach to the neighborhood, and people who live there get to go there for free. But on some just purely architectural level, the 16-foot concrete wall that surrounds the courtyard can be perceived, especially by people around it, as something that's not entirely welcoming, right? And so we spent a lot of time in the neighborhood, so we wanted to do these 2 things. We wanted to strengthen connections and recycle. We spent a lot of time in the neighborhood just hanging out, trying to find what was happening around PS1. So one person we talked to was this guy Mike, who owns this place, Checker Management, right across the street from MoMA PS1. It's a cab company, and so drivers go there and they wait for their shift to start. And to make the shift a little bit nicer, the owner, Mike, he built a small impromptu plaza with plastic chairs and tables and shade awning. And the drivers come here, they hang out, they swap stories, they drink coffee, whatever. And so we thought it was an interesting space, and we kind of had an epiphany here. We thought, in some ways, PS1's programmatic requirements, seating, shade, and water feature, can sometimes overlap with the needs of warm-up's neighbors. So this gave us an idea for kind of radical recycling that tries to strengthen the institution's ties to the neighborhood by matching warm-up's programmatic needs with those of its neighbors. So we went around the neighborhood and we asked every institution or neighborhood group we met with, and we met with over 200 local businesses, is there something you need that we could design, use in the courtyard during the warm-up, and then donate to you in the fall once the warm-up is over? So the guys in the taxi stand all said, you know, we wait a lot, we would love some things to do while we wait. Maybe a checker table, maybe a ping pong table. Mike, the guy who owns this, is a really good ping pong player. So we talked to Ozzy Laverme from the Teamsters Union right across the street from MoMA PS1, and he said, oh, we got this plaza, we got this like little patch of green here, but it's kind of messed up, and maybe we could use some picnic tables, maybe a lounge, and some trees. There's some kids from St. Margaret Mary Mead's Head Start, you know, who really wanted a sandbox for this cool playground. And here's Stefanos from the Western Queens Compost Initiative. He wanted some compost tumblers, and Terry Hughes here from Variety Boys and Girls Club. He wanted two things, actually. He wanted trees to separate the playground from 21st Street, which is very busy, but he also wanted a lifeguard chair for this new pool that they have. We talked to the dogs. They don't like the hard surface. The neighborhood dogs in some of the dog parks, they wanted some mulch. This guy runs a ballet studio, and he's expanding his studio. This is right around the corner from MoMA PS1, but he's got these. He needs mirrors, right, for his business, so that he could teach dance classes there. Guys on the boat, Long Island City Community Boathouse. They want basins to wash their feet. They wanted some picnic tables. Mark from the community garden wants a rainwater collection system. These kids from a daycare wanted a rock climbing wall, right? So we mapped all these suggestions out. This is a fairly old drawing. It doesn't take into account all the people we talked to, but we mapped everything. We wanted to strive for stuff in this quadrant, things that are fun, but also in the public interest. So when the library said, oh, great, we could really use some books, we said, well, no, that doesn't work for summer fun, right? We're trying to make matches, things that are fun in the courtyard and things that work for the neighborhood. So this is what we came up with. Is that at the end of the day, these are the objects, this big collection of stuff, trees, lifeguard chairs, stages, ping pong tables, rock climbing walls. This is here's some pictures. This is actually a picture of every space that's going to be improved by stuff from holding pattern. So there's over 60, and here's a map of where everything is going to go. By the way, tomorrow is the day where we're going to deliver all of this furniture, the rock climbing walls, the lifeguard chairs, everything to the neighborhood. So just to give you an example of some of the spaces, you notice that there's a lot of trees. A lot of people wanted trees. So here are just some of the spaces that we're going to improve with trees. We partnered with the New York Restoration Project, and they generously offered to help us deliver and plant trees in places like this, New York Rehabilitation Center, these kind of barren parking lots. So in some ways, the project is really a neighborhood improvement project, is the way we like to see it.
So this is an illustration that we developed to represent the project. So here you can see the museum, the old school building, its courtyard. You're probably all very familiar with it. And we show this in the context of the neighborhood. And we think of the project as having 3 phases. The first is when people ask for stuff, as Dan mentioned. We quoted these requests here in yellow. So like, for example, over here, you can see we need ballet mirrors for our expansion, or we can use a stage for our b-boy workshops. And then in the last phase is when the furniture and the other stuff that was requested by different organizations goes out to their owners, so to speak. And as Dan mentioned, this is going to happen tomorrow. And this future phase here is shown by these little clouds. And so, for example, up here, you can get a little glimpse of the mirrors in use by the Long Island City School of Ballet. And over here is the b-boy stage in use on the roof of the 5 Points building. And then this is what happens in the meantime during warm-up over the summer. So all the stuff, the trees, the furniture, the mirrors, and so on are used in the courtyard. And with this approach, we radically expanded our client group from one client, the museum, one very important client, the museum, to 50 clients that included the ballet school, to 5 Points, to the Boys and Girls Club, and so on. And so Holding Pattern really operates like an urban design project. It's really about developing an environment that responds to multiple, very different and sometimes changing desires, something that a fixed piece of architecture could never do. We sometimes liken our approach to that of the Iron Chef, of the beloved franchise TV show, as the Iron Chef is given a bunch of ingredients and under tremendous time constraints and under the careful watch of a live audience, is challenged to make an amazing meal. And we worked with a set of materials and objects selected by others, like the mirrors and the trees, and sought to make an interesting environment. So let me show you what we mean. Dan mentioned that a lot of people wanted trees. So we located the 60 red oak trees, trees that were donated by the New York Restoration Project, in the rectangular courtyard that is to the right of the museum's new entrance. You can see it here. We used straw bales to create planting beds and backfilled them with mulch. We planted the trees in a grid, but the planters are organized more like a maze, evoking more traditional hedge gardens, and the feeling and smell of the space is very distinct, damp and organic like a forest. And here is the mirror room, the so-called mirror room. We had some fun referencing minimalism here. It worked pretty well in the context of those 16-foot blank concrete walls and the simple gravel ground. And then onto the sort of the main courtyard, the largest space, which Barry Bergdahl referred to as the public rec room. This is actually a funny photo. This is one photo taken at the threshold between the tree room and the rec room on the left. And this is where most of the items are placed and where people interact with them, like the stools, and the picnic tables, the bike stand, and the ping pong tables. The majority of these pieces worked kind of like a family, although we did buy a few pieces off the shelf, like those ping pong tables. And here you can start to see it all being used. We developed a labeling system with the graphic designer's thumb, our frequent collaborators, and each item got what we called a museum label describing the piece's so-called provenance, and that was coupled with a grid showing where all the items go, and we just used a black marker to sort of circle the final home of each piece. And we also created these hold for tags to make visible that these pieces were being held for someone else, and we used a branding iron to sort of burn in the Holding Pattern logo. You can see the space filling up on the warm-up day. The Mies-inspired chaise lounge, the misting stage, the lifeguard stand, the rock climbing wall is actually really popular with that age group, incredibly. The sandbox, the chess tables, the foosball table. We also had 24 purple leaf plums in the main courtyard that we put in containers. And so here you can see it in full action with the furniture being appropriated and moved around in all different ways. So here you see the project being used primarily by two audiences, the museum audience and here the warm-up audience. But we also invited organizations in the neighborhood we worked with to make use of MoMA PS1's courtyard for programs of their own making during the summer months. The events included b-boy workshops, ballet workshops with the Long Island City School of Ballet, readings with the Queens Library, a senior citizen summer, oh, that actually we didn't do, and, excuse me. Quilt making workshops with the New York Irish Center. So Dan mentioned Eric of the Long Island School of Ballet, Long Island City School of Ballet. Here he is in the studio. You remember he needed mirrors. So here are the mirrors in the installation. And here's a photo from the event we co-organized with him called A Brief History of Dance. And that's actually where the mirrors will go. Queens Library did a series of readings. You can see here the quilt making workshops with the New York Irish Center, the bike repair workshop. And then just yesterday, we had the Long Island City Neighborhood Expo. A number of different neighborhood organizations were involved. David Brooks sort of an artist whose work is exhibited in the museum, teamed up with the Queen's Library to read 2 books while encouraging kids to draw elements of the story they were listening to. It was really great. We had a b-boy workshop. There was a sort of a aerosol art technique workshop. And with the expo and with all of these summer programs, we tried to create different forms of dialogue between the museum and the multiple publics, the different publics that for the most part had never set foot inside the museum. You could say that our goal here was to sort of increase the publicness of the courtyard. And in a way just to make it more like Long Island City. And in this spirit of dialogue, we also work with the museum bookstore to engage these different groups. We asked each group which book was important or influential, and we had that on display in the bookstore. You can see there the Royal Ballet School Diaries, selected by Eric. And then lastly, we developed this newspaper, again in collaboration with them, which one, introduced our clients and their organizations, and 2, it sort of, it showed basically what they asked for and where it's all ultimately going, which is going to happen tomorrow. And this free newspaper was available at the museum, so museum and warm-up visitors could learn more about the project, but it was also distributed out into the neighborhood, again to sort of open the museum to the outside and blur the boundaries between it and the surrounding neighborhood. And here you see some images of those pages.
Last not least, let's talk about the structure here. As you probably know, the courtyard of MoMA PS1 gets extremely hot in the summer, and almost the only programmatic requirement for GSAPP is to provide some shade. To do so, we devised this canopy structure here. It's a simple and inexpensive, albeit kind of accidentally heroic structure out of ropes and fabric, polyjute, which is a lightweight landscaping fabric. And it has sort of this funny shape. It's not something that we designed out of the blue, but it's derived out of the courtyard as it is. Part of what makes warm-up events so interesting is the sort of eccentricity, we think, of the courtyard, right? It's sort of a weird party, and part of that weirdness has to do with the oddness of this courtyard, right? That the fact that the best seat in the house is basically the terrace of the neighbors who are planting their tomatoes up there is somewhat strange, for example, and as some of these eccentricities in the architecture of the courtyard. And so when we started thinking about how to provide shade for this situation, what we didn't want to do is place an object within this a beautifully designed object within this strange courtyard, maybe a piece of architecture that might get into people's way. You saw the courtyard layout with these pieces of furniture very much about interaction and people moving stuff around, and so we didn't really want to get into the way of that, and we didn't really want to touch the ground. And so what we started doing is really just connecting the edges of the courtyard as it already is. The funny shape of this courtyard is really wasn't really anybody's design decision, but it's sort of the result of many circumstances and decisions over the years, right? There's, you just see here you see it, the grid, obviously, right, which is cut off at this corner by Jackson Avenue. There is the old school building. There is then this neighboring parcel that sticks right into the courtyard with its terrace. And then again in the 90s, there was this decision to put up this 16-foot wall around the courtyard. Actually, in this wall, there are these open holes, actually 38 holes, 2 feet below the top edge of the wall from the concrete formwork. And we decided to thread ropes from these 38 holes over to the building itself, just as sort of the simplest way of providing a roof for the entire courtyard, right? So obviously we didn't really want to put a roof over the neighbors, so we had to pull here the neighbors, so we had to pull that in at that point, resulting in this shape, this sort of hyperboloid surface that is again directly developed out of the edge conditions of this courtyard. Here you see our first model, the harp. Right, just bringing these strings across to from the edges of the courtyard. This is a little bit rougher working model we had going, but you see here in this image is somewhat of the beauty of this shape, sort of 50s aesthetic that came out of this simple operation of connecting the edges. And we really very much like this shape in that it is, again, made out of lines, little bit sagging lines now, but in the model, straight lines. It's made out of lines, and it has this hyperbolated surface, which isn't the result of some algorithm, but simply connecting the edges. So another model photo, this rendering, which we made to sell the project, and then the thing in action. The structure changed very much over the very short design period, but you see it looking up. This was actually the parametric digital model that we worked on with our structure engineer. It was sort of an interesting challenge to find the right tension and the right placement of these ropes. The edge conditions of the building have all, you can put different loads on these edge conditions, and each rope, as you can imagine, has different length. So actually very useful. Here, a parametric design came in very handily to do this. But let me just show you quickly how the structure operates now. So this, the ropes are just attached to this hole. So you see one of those holes over there. This was one of the earlier mock-ups. So there's just a hole in the wall. We just put these rods to the holes and attach the ropes on the outside. So there's this little hint of what happens on the inside on the outside wall along Jackson Avenue here over these porta potties. You see a little bit of what's going on in there. Here they come across over the wall, and there you see the fins that are attached to these ropes. There was a lot of back and forth about the wind loads on these fins, and we ended up actually having to make them retractable. So here you see one of those fins that's pulled back all the way to the wall, just to deal with the tremendous wind loads that could potentially be on these fins. So then the ropes all run through this choke point, this element, which we call the bridge. You see here, which is simply two cargo straps that are knitted together. Sort of turned out, it looked a little oddly Calatrava, which was a little bit of a shock in the beginning, but then the fins, the ropes come out on the inner courtyard side at the building and go across to the parapet, which you see here. This is a photo from the roof. So you see the bridge down here, and then the ropes going up to the parapet. You see the railing there. And if you keep that in mind for a moment, here you see what's happening behind that railing. So the problem here was, or one of the conditions for the design was that we couldn't attach anything. Obviously, it's a temporary project, so we couldn't attach anything permanently to the building. So the way these ropes are held in place is through ballast, right? So you see the rope coming over the railing here, and then it's tied down to a very long wood platform that is weighed down by concrete blocks. So it's really just using the snow load, right? The roof can carry a certain snow load, and since this thing is only temporary, it's only happening in the summer, there's not going to be any snow, so we can use that snow load with these concrete blocks. And then with the innovation of making these fins retractable, you see also this other rope on which these run, and then it goes to this device here. So there you can imagine us with Hurricane Irene approaching. You can imagine us standing here, and like the sailors on top of the Colosseum, like crazy, retracting these fins. That's it.
Thanks so much. That was terrific. So I guess we'll move on to the second part of the program and welcome Therrien and Barley for an interview about this project.
So, thank you, Dan, Tobias, and Georgeen, for welcoming us into your process, and also to you and to Gavin for welcoming our project into your environment. As Gavin mentioned, 2 years ago as students at the school, Chris and I in the MArch program, that's better, as students of Barry Bergdahl, who has joined us tonight, we started what we were calling, naively, I guess, a kind of oral history project where we went around and interviewed, it was the 10th anniversary of the Young Architects Program now, in the 12th year, and interviewed almost everybody involved, including all of the finalists and a lot of the curators and directors and so on. And this is a project that we're now kind of picking up again and trying to kind of complete and catch up. So we wanted to kind of be as efficient as possible, and strangely being efficient meant having a really short presentation so that we could give a little bit of background to kind of get everybody up to speed, and then we can have a conversation. So this might be stuff that you guys already know, but for the people in the room, in 1997 in Queens, like you mentioned, Fred Fisher, the architect, added the 16-foot wall around what used to be a public school in Queens for PS1, which well, only became PS1 as it was known in the early mid-90s under the directorship of Alana Heiss. In the same year in Berlin in 1997, Alana Heiss and Klaus Wiesenbach, who's a curator in Berlin and is actually now the director of PS1, went to a party in Berlin, the Young African Artist Market, YAM, excuse me, that was basically a kind of play landscape on the banks of the Spree River that had this kind of, I guess I shouldn't say who I'm quoting, but where you could drink and drug and park your kids and basically party for 3 days straight. But it also had this kind of architectural quality to it. There was a group named Peanuts, with a Z, who designed the space. And so it was interesting for Chris and I to see that there was actually a kind of precedent where it was kind of presiding in a kind of party, but also a kind of architecture of that party. In Queens in 1998, Alana Heiss and Klaus decided to bring the kind of idea to PS1. And so they invited the Viennese artist collective Gelatin to do a project that they called Percutaneous Delights. And to quote Klaus, excuse me, so there were these requirements of shade, cooling, water, entertainment, drinks, possibly children's daycare, but all of this was basically obvious. So when we worked with Gelatin, the artists in '98, what they did was made an igloo out of fridges. They made a room where all the fridges were attached, and the interior was just the space between the fridges that was cold. They made a sun tanning pad, which was just aluminum foil, and so you were lying on the sun being reflected onto you. It was crazy. I think they did something which was basically like a dark room for people having sex, but they kind of didn't say that. They made this huge tower out of office furniture. I don't want to exaggerate, but it was at least 60 feet high, end quote. And it was also the kickoff of the first warm-up series, which in 1998 was a month-long series of world-famous DJs coming to this kind of party environment, and all done on a budget of $10,000. The next year, 1998, PS1 and MoMA started their relationship, and this quote taken from a conversation between Alana Heiss and MoMA director Glenn Lowry at PS1. From Alana Heiss, at PS1, we don't intend to start collecting, and scholarship in itself is not going to become a primary goal. By merging with the modern, perhaps those issues can be utterly avoided, and we can use the magic, the spaces and halls of PS1, to house the contradictory and spontaneous results of the creation of art. And I just wanted to highlight that because we'll get back shortly in our interview into the idea that PS1 is a kind of space that has more flexibility to kind of traffic in uncertainty. So in Queens in 1999, a $200,000 gift was made to Philip Johnson for his 93rd birthday by the Estee Lauder heirs. And Philip Johnson created very postmodern looking, and in fact even more so in the model where you see the flags, a kind of massive DJ towers out of scaffolding where there was, again, a summer party. And so he was, the Young Architects Program had yet to be born, but the 93 years young Philip Johnson was kind of effectively the transition point into the YAPP program. So the following 12 years, which we're now just closing up tomorrow, I guess, of 2000 to 2011, we'll just skim through really quickly to give those of you who aren't familiar with the archive, a kind of sense of what has gone down over the past 10 years. So the first year was Dunescape by Shop Architects when they were kind of a young upstart, and now they're a firm of, I think, almost over 100. Lindy Roy, who was teaching here at one point and might still be, in 2001 was Subwave. In 2002, William Massey's Playa Urbana. In 2003, Tom Wiscombe and Emergence Lightwing. In 2004, Ann Architects, who some of you might have studio with. In 2005, Hernan Diaz-Alonso, a graduate of this school, did SUR. In 2006, Obra Architects did Beat Fuse. In 2007, Ball Nogues from Los Angeles did Liquid Sky. In 2008, Work AC did PF1. In 2009, After Party, including GSAPP faculty member Hilary Sample, did After Party with Moss. In 2010, Soil, if they're here, teach me how to say the name, did Pole Dance, and then, of course, this past year you've just seen from Interboro. And I'm actually not sure now if this is the rendering or a photograph. But one thing that we tried to do in our research project, and I promise this is only 3 more slides, is to not just look at the 10 winners, but to open up the entire field to kind of understand what is the kind of group that was operating over the 10 years. So there's actually at this point 58 kind of would-be projects and 12 realized. But one thing that we also kind of want to underscore in the project is that at the kind of base, even though some of the most innovative architecture over the past 12 years in New York City and in kind of around the world has been incubated at PS1, at the base of it is still a kind of party. And so it's, as Chris would put it, kind of architecture throughout the last 12 years has kind of been, in some cases in harmony and in some cases at war with the party. This is Hernan's project getting trashed. And actually, I believe Hernan had to go back multiple times and touch it up. Also, the party architects are not impervious to the party. For those of you who might know Amal from Work AC, you can find her on Flickr having a good time. You can also find other people having a good time in her architecture in 2008. Not only a party, but also a place for young architects to experiment and test things. This is Obra Architects, and I believe this is a photograph showing when their design actually got beyond the limits and failed just before the kind of going live. And we'll leave it there, and I'll let Chris kick it off with, we can invite back to start the interview.
Very good.
Thanks.
So hopefully Interboro is now completely briefed on the entire history of the Young Architects Program and very easily contextualize their work within the larger body of 50 other projects and 12 previous years. It's actually my first question. I think what we're interested in understanding is what role or how much of the history of the Young Architects Program did you take into account when developing your own proposal, and how would you position your project within that lineage, if you could?
Well, maybe just to start out, we knew the project, the previous projects to begin with, and respected the designers, but our respect grew exponentially once we saw the schedule and the budget with our own eyes. So we admire all those projects, and we always looked at them. I would say that for us, the ones that are really relevant or that we discussed are the last 3, right? Starting with the Work AC one, where you said it's still a party space, but I think that at that point there's ambition to do something else, to use to leverage the project, to realize maybe an ambition that goes beyond the party space. So those are the project that we're closest aligned to, I think.
But I would also say, and I hope that this was communicated in the presentation, I think we at the same time looked at those other things, but we really saw the competition as a vehicle for us to continue to explore issues that were central to our practice. And I think that, I know that like doing competitions always gets such a bad rap, but I think that for us, doing competitions has always been very, very productive, and as a way for us to really sort of stake out the territory that we're interested in. And so I think that there was this kind of dialogue. On the one hand, we were, of course, aware and sort of admiring of the other projects, but at the same time, I think we saw it just as something that we were working on in the context of our office.
And I think we've also been talking to a lot of architects about what was the brief that you got when you started the competition, and we're curious how long that brief was. What were the elements of it for you?
It was very simple, and I remember in one of the early meetings, we actually, when we knew that we were one of the 5 finalists, we asked for the program, and I think Tony Guerrero, one of the people at PS1 who was often administering the competition, said he didn't give us a written program. It was actually something that was more, create shade, add some water.
Yeah. He was like, yeah, I guess I could write something up, right? That's what I think that was his reaction when we asked for the brief.
Yeah, and I think to us, the interesting thing about this kind of brief was that it was actually happening at the same time as the Foreclosed show, which has kind of the largest brief possible. So it's interesting that in this program, the architects actually have to create their own agenda, create their own brief. And I'm curious where the agenda for the brief that you wrote for yourself was. Like, what was the brief? What was most important for you in this competition?
I would say we started out with these 2 points, right, that Dan mentioned at the beginning. To one, the question of a temporary project, because we had already a certain experience with temporary projects, and the question how do you leverage this short period of time, and what happens to all the energy and all the design and all the money that goes into what you're doing for this time? What happens to that after that? Is there a way of making that more useful for somebody else beyond the confines of this party? So that was one of our starting points, and the other one was really Queens, which were just like to hang out in. The question of how you can actually make some sort of connection between the amazing things that are happening at MoMA at PS1 and all the amazing things that are happening out there. We can build up some sort of relationship between the 2 things that are, still fairly isolated. So those were our 2 starting points.
But also, as Dan mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I think more generally we're interested in thinking about how architecture can perform in a slightly broader way, and sort of, I think that we were most definitely interested in looking at the Young Architects Program and demonstrating that architecture can do more, and so and in that way sort of have this kind of engagement with the city beyond it. And so I would say that would be definitely part of our agenda as well.
Just to add to that, one thing that we were really excited about is that we showed this a little bit, but there were little tags on all the objects, right? It said exactly where this tree was going to go and where this ping pong table was going to go, and that had the effect of bringing people, school kids, for example, to come and check in on their tree, and I think get people to the museum who frankly had never been inside, and we really wanted to kind of embed a kind of interest and a stake in it for a lot more people. And so we were really happy to see that. We did that with the events, but the objects themselves did that just as people would come in and check in on their stuff. So that was a really, I think that was something we set out to do from the beginning.
And then maybe more specifically, the brief or the program for all the different elements that evolved very much over the spring. We just started out with when we presented the project to our clients, we presented the roof, the canopy structure, which changed somewhat, but not that much. But then we presented this idea or this framework of asking people in the neighborhood for the brief, right? And we had talked to a few people, but not too many, because we didn't want to, not win and then have promised stuff. So the MoMA PS1 took a certain gamble in taking that idea and having a brief that really very much happened after we already got the commission. So for example, there were in the initial presentation, there were I think 3 trees in there, because we just said, maybe a few trees here and there. And then that became a very important element, but really only in April or May actually. So the brief in terms of what are the parts of this program evolved very much, and very, very short time before the actual opening.
Just quickly, what was great is that the project got richer the more people we spoke to. As we started to accumulate mirrors and lifeguard chair and rock climbing wall, it proved that it was that the process worked. So as we got further and further along, we got more and more good ideas and got to make a more delicious meal, as Georgeen suggested.
And it's also really a great thing. I mean, we made a little joke about it, but it's really a great thing the way that the program is so loose, because given the other constraints on the project, the very, very short time frame and the limited budget, I think that it's a really intelligent way to sort of organize the competition.
Tobias, you mentioned that the client, the museum or museums, kind of took a risk on your project because if you kind of already started to make the promise before you were selected, and then even by being selected, there's the possibility that you might not complete the project and you might not be able to actually give to the community what you've promised in a way. And so I guess I'm wondering, you've spread it out to have multiple clients, but I guess I'm wondering with MoMA and PS1 being a kind of almost, is it one client or 2? Or I guess I'm wondering in the process, in the briefing process and in the jury process, how did you perceive the difference between the kind of 2 institutions? And was there, because one thing that we try to highlight in the presentation is that PS1 is, in Alana Heiss's comment back in the late 90s, was that PS1 is a space that allows for this kind of level of experimentation. So I guess I'm wondering if there was a difference when you were presenting the risk from the 2 different institutions, or was it kind of one voice coming back to you?
Well, I think that the institution has been changing, but they, I think, gave us a one voice.
We don't know what happened behind closed doors, but
what feedback did you get in the jury? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, we got, actually the comments were they were so right on. I mean, I think that I remember there were 2 really important comments. I would say first, Glenn Lowry actually identified a kind of distinction between the renderings and our material studies about the actual shape or tautness of the fins. And that really sort of, I think, was really astute and sort of highlighted some of the major design development issues that we needed to address in the development of the project. And then I would also point to Barry's comments about the family of furniture, because initially when we did the competition and presented the project, we really presented the framework, this idea, and the roof, but the furniture itself was not really designed. We had this idea that it would look a little bit like Lent space and that it might be made of marine grade plywood, but in the end, we really spent a long time developing and playing with and bringing a certain level of craft to the furniture, and I think that was directly influenced by Barry's comments when we first found out that we had gotten the commission.
I think it's interesting. I had a really pithy question prepared, which was, I'll tell you the question and I'll tell you what I thought was going to be the answer and tell me if I'm right. The question was, what are the 3 most important computer programs that you used in this project? And I'm assuming that they're not the normal ones. And I'm just curious, how did you work, what were the most important computer tools that you used?
Aren't you going to answer that?
I don't want to answer it anymore. Now that I ask it, I don't actually want to answer it.
Excel, first and foremost, because we had to manage over 200 people and their ideas and their phone numbers, and that's kind of, what can I say? Excel was important. I hate to say it, but it really was.
Apps and scan to scan the illustration.
Right.
We did, I mean, we really did
The process was really very sort of iterative and hands-on. Like we built we did many mock-ups of the fins, and that was really something, like we had this kind of, we had studied it during the competition phase, but it was really resolved through mock-ups. And the furniture also was really done in that way. So it was a much more, I think, sort of crafted project than a digitally designed project, which it was a slightly new, it was the most of all of the projects that we've ever done.
But I would say, I know where you're going with the question, and I would say we obviously use computers in the office, but I think that time has passed when, we use pencils too, but buildings don't have to look like you use a pencil, right? That period is, I would think, slightly over, that everything has to be really about that tool that you use. And it's great that we have them, so let's use them to do things that we can do with the city, right? That we can do with with PS1 Courtyard.
Yeah, you just said the time's passed. I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate more on what you think the kind of time is, because one of our interests in the YAP project was that it kind of, even the microhistory itself serves as a bit of a kind of trace of what's in the air, what's kind of happening. And I guess I'm wondering, I think that you guys are the first, your urban design and urban planning is the main kind of focus of the practice, and there's a kind of history of architects in the YAP program. So I guess I'm wondering if, is the kind of, is it in the air? Is it shifting? Is the kind of way that we deal with kind of design and issues moving over away from kind of, traditional architecture into an urban design kind of perspective, or,
Maybe, for us it's a very small project, relatively small project. It's dealing with this courtyard, but for us setting up this situation where we're dealing with, one main client, but a lot of people have different ideas and different wishes and introduce different programs, that is ultimately, urban design work, coordinating and, organizing, but responding to different constituents. And yeah, we're an urban design firm, we're also architects, but looking beyond the architectural projects or the beauty of the isolated object that it is, I think something that is in the air, and that when we say that the projects starting with the farm are the most relevant to us, we see that kind of happening around that time, right? That people really use this project to explore other things that are beyond just form making.
And there's just so many people out there kind of whining about where the practice is going and how we don't have any voice anymore, and that's really not where we're coming from, in that we're really excited about architecture's potential to improve the world. And I think that our way of working and the way that this project demonstrates that architecture can be connected to these other things, and that when other groups and constituents have a real interest in architectural production, architecture will be more relevant and just plain better.
One of the super interesting, and we're going to open it up in just a second, but one of the super interesting things for us is the concept of youth itself. It's in the title of the program, the kind of Young Architects Program, and it seems like that answer is, from the kind of series of interviews that we've had, we've started to kind of codify what it means to be young. There's a lot of kind of the kind of fetishization of software, the kind of the tendency to kind of overreach and get to the point where you take the project on so full that you kind of can't swallow it. And it seems like your project, I guess I'm wondering, what are the kind of most youthful moments of the project, or do you see it and your firm as a kind of youthful practice? Like, how does the word youth kind of sit with you?
Well, first off, you gentlemen know that you're never supposed to ask.
To Tobias and Dan.
The sign of male dominance in architecture.
Tobias and Dan.
Gosh, it's a good question. I'm stumped. I'm thinking of we had lots of programs for kids. We had ballet kids and library kids, and but I know that's not what you mean.
Another way to think about it is just sort of, was there ever a moment of crisis in this project, or was anything ever did someone almost fall off the building, hanging the things. I'm just curious, because a lot of the kind of excitement of the young firm is to watch them go through this kind of trial by fire. And I'm curious if you guys kind of cracked the code in a different way, or if there was some sort of young blunder along the way. It doesn't have to be. You know.
Well, there were major crises, having less to do with youth and more with wind loads.
Yeah, I mean, we did make some mistakes, and I don't think we want them memorialized in this recording. But I would say one thing that was a big step for us, and I think this would be a sign of like being at this transition of sort of young firm to something else, is that we, in our past projects, we always micromanaged everything, and we always, I think we more tightly controlled the actual production of everything. And in this project, we gave more responsibility to other people because we had to, because of the time and the context. And I have to say that we were really not disappointed. I mean, and it was, I think that is a sign of a firm growing when you can actually do more with a sort of a larger structure. And so, because we've had such a wide range of projects that are not often about sort of doing, that they haven't always been about buildings, that we were able to sort of keep this sort of closer control. But with this project, we actually did give more leverage. I mean, of course, we were ultimately responsible, but we did give more, involvement to other people, and it was I think it was a great experience for us.
Maybe one last, and then we'll open it up, is you've won other awards with the word young in them. And I guess we're wondering.
The young.
Last question.
There are a few awards with old attached.
Well, that is kind of precisely the question: is, are you kind of tired of being called young in a way? Like, it seems like it doesn't sit well with you. So, if you were to win another award with young in it, would you feel like you weren't, how would you kind of react to winning another award with the word young in it, or do you want to be how do you want people to see your firm?
It doesn't bother me so much.
I'm just making a joke. It doesn't bother me either.
But I guess that, on some level there is this idea like that you do, when you're starting out and you do all these projects, not for money, but because they're going to bring you money later on. And this is a real concern, right? That a lot of the work, some of the work we do, not all, is work that we do less so because it makes us a lot of money, but because it sort of increases our odds of making more down the line. And I think just that the firm at a certain point, all firms at a certain point need to transition from, like, we're going to work our butts off at night and do competitions and just do projects on spec and things. And it's really important that in our profession we don't sustain young too long, because then we'll lose, people will stop fighting. We'll lose the spirit and the kind of desire to do all this work now and put in all the sweat equity so that it'll pay off later. So that's the only danger, I think, with young. Like, you win this, this audience of lots of people, and that'll help you later on. And here's another award. We're gonna, and we still get calls like, well, we're not, this is a great project. Like, we don't have that much money, but, like, this will be seen by 10 million people, and which is great. And I'm not talking about the YAPP project, but we get these, and there's a certain point where you have to say, enough's enough. We're professionals. We have families and bills, and we're at a point where we've increased, I think, a certain amount of cultural capital, and I think it's only fair that firms in our situation can cash in. How else to put it?
Perfect.
That sounds a little crass. I don't mean to put it that way.
So if there's any developers in the audience or any questions, if anyone has questions in the audience for.
Yeah, I have one about money. I'm curious. Talking about, you hear all the time about, I don't know what the figure is, but whatever the low budget is for this, and you also hear about how much money and time firms and the people like us who volunteer for them or work with them for this competition, how much they put into it. So I'm curious to have you talk a little bit more about the budget. And one question I had looking at your project was, what would it look like if you had been given $20,000 more? What would your project have looked like?
One thing is, again, that we set up somewhat of a flexible framework, and you know, got that approved, and then worked, basically developed the project, or the number of things that we were building when we already had the project. Also added a moment of flexibility to that, right? We didn't say we're building this giant, you know, monster here, and then we have to deliver. But there was a degree of flexibility there in just, okay, you want a rock climbing wall, but we don't have any money more. Actually, the rock climbing wall we ended up building from our own money, because just those kids were so nice, and they really came to the event.
They came every week.
They were looking for their rock climbing wall.
No, but we didn't do the stadium seating.
That's right.
We did take things out.
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I think there's the easy answer to what we would have done. I think we would have built more stuff for more people. We had some great ideas. I wanted a tiki bar, and somebody wanted, the rain barrel wastewater system. And,
we would have built a barbecue tent for Sixto.
Yeah, or a domino table, maybe for the guys in the loading dock. I mean, we had so many ideas, and it was so hard to say, like, oh, this would be so cool, but we just don't have the money. And we could have. I mean, I think we could have spent our own money on it. A lot of people said, oh, well, so many people are going to see this project, like, you should, but it's not the spirit of the project. There's a budget, and you should do. I think we felt we should do what we could do for the budget that we had. Otherwise, it's not fair for people, necessarily in the future who maybe don't have the means to do that, right?
Sorry, just because you said that it seems like the most influential project, if I can call it the most, from the kind of YAPP archive was the Work AC project in 2008. But you've also said, you just said we don't want to build giant monsters, but if anything was a giant monster, it was Dan and Amal's project. And also, you even said earlier on that your project, the Finns, were kind of accidentally heroic. If anything was purposefully heroic, it was their project. And if anything was a beautiful object that got in the way of the party, it was their project. So all of the things that you said that you didn't want to do basically describe Dan and Amal's project. But for you, that was also the kind of turning point in the kind of archive of YAPP. And so I guess I'm wondering, is it safe to say that there's no precedent for your kind of approach to it? Are you kind of offering because one thing that we're interested in is when you take on that archive, when there is kind of no brief. I mean, if there's no brief, one of the things you have to look at is the kind of, especially living in New York and knowing the history, is that history. Are you attempting to kind of inflect the arc of YAPP in a way, or are you attempting, because other firms will come at it and try to kind of guess where YAPP is going and just stand in front of it?
One thing, I mean, I think we were the first firm to take programming as seriously as we did. We had events every week. And we showed you some of them, but there were more. I mean, every weekend we were out there. We just put out a call. We said, the courtyard is yours. We can't give you money, but this is an opportunity for your institution. You can find a new audience. And everyone kind of thought, great, the New York Irish Center had these quilting workshops. And for us, that I don't think anyone had done that in the past. And I think there's certainly precedence for lots of aspects of this project, but for us, I think that was really important and unique.
Go ahead, Jose.
Like the driving concept of your project has identified sort of important issues, from institutional critique to sort of community building and other important subjects. But I'm guessing if you thought about the sort of like afterlife of the sort of like holding cycle, because you of course create ties with like the community and specific institutions, but like once the objects go back to them, the sort of all the effort that you've done in sort of like building a relationship between the institution and these other institutions. I mean, I don't know if like what happens after, and I don't know. I guess the question is if you thought about like how maybe PS1 could sustain that relationship, also, I mean, in the practice of as like urban designers, I mean, I think you also identify sort of like important problematics that of sort of like social patterns within, like, for example, Lent space. Like, what happens after that you've sort of implemented this set of strategies of sort of living the space, but like what happens once that project is gone? Because most of the projects that you presented are sort of like temporary installations, and I guess my question is if you've thought of like a sort of like larger strategy of how you can adapt these into not only sort of like programs such as GSAPP, but also within the sort of like larger practice of urban design, right?
Yeah.
One way in GSAPP also like maybe the extras I mean not expecting sort of for like outreach programs. You know, like I mean
That's right.
architects can build that. You know,
It's also interesting to me that you guys have raised the bar in terms of community participation, and this is exaggerating, but you've opened the floodgates to the community, and so now what does that mean for PS1 in a really real way? Is that what they wanted? But I think it's interesting, you know, that you guys took this opportunity to actually challenge the entire interface.
I think that we propose, if we thought that PS1 was like a mean institution that really, you know, just wanted to like lock itself inside and like not engage the community, we wouldn't have proposed this because we knew it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But that's not the case. I mean, again, free admission. There's a lot. They do a lot there for the community. We sort of wanted to ride that wave and take it to the next level. So I think what we did was perceive some kind of something that already existed there and had been existing for a while, and just ride it. So I hope that you know that we did the right thing and that we opened the floodgates, and this is a good thing. But I think a lot of people honestly came to MoMA PS1 for the first time because of this project. I mean, a lot of people who came to the programs had never been there, and that's a legacy. They've been there. They have something attached to it. I think that they'll remember that they had a tree in this courtyard. That, you know, we hope to give people pictures of where their object being used by, you know, people partying and so there's a connection, and we hope it'll be lasting.
Mm-hmm. And I would also, I mean, I think Jose's comments are so interesting, and I'm sorry we didn't give a sort of a more robust answer, but I think also, I mean, it is true all those people we feel that they have a stake now and that they are going to come back, and that's good for the institution. I don't think it's something that anybody would be unhappy about. But I think also, just like we were kind of excited about the way that the furniture moved around during warm-up, I think that part of us, like, I think it would be a really good idea to sort of use the money for programming, but at the same time, I don't see ourselves as creating some kind of sort of participation dictatorship. We're really interested in like what happens after we leave. So we're interested, like in the courtyard, we're interested what happens when people start moving things around, and we're also sort of interested what's going to happen to these pieces of furniture once we're not there anymore. And also, same thing with these kinds of relationships. It's almost like when we talked about the Dead Malls project, it's about incubating these ideas, but it's not about sort of permanently modifying the gene. I mean, I think we want to see how it sort of evolves without being really heavy-handed.
Is there another question?
Yeah, speaking of that evolution, I think it's really interesting that the work is almost self-reflexive of your firm, where it evolves from kind of the land banking into the downtown development into PS1. And I was just wondering how you take that holding pattern model, or what you expect to see in the future in that evolution devoid of furniture or anything like that.
Could you just add a little bit more? You're asking whether or not we will continue to use these particular practices.
Are you done with the holding pattern, or are you going to continue kind of these evolutions into the next stage? So what would the ideal project be from here if you've already done this community involvement for the project? Would you do an interior to get the cash?
Yes, from now on, you know, high rise.
High-end furniture from now on.
I think I just one thing I mean, we really love the sort of I think the physical. I think this is something that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked in the project, but I think we really love the sort of the physical and material aspects of the project, of what was produced in that space. But at the same time, I think that I, maybe not speaking for the whole group, I would really love, like, for example, to take something like Lent space and be able to sort of work with the city to like develop a new like layer to the zoning to sort of incentivize temporary uses. So in a way to sort of make, say, privately owned spaces more more public. So like, say, for example, like the POPs program in New York City, where the privately owned public spaces where developers got FAR bonuses to provide public amenities. I think it would be really great if we could also work at more of a policy level to sort of encourage this kind of experimentation. So on the one hand, I think we'd like to do sort of just more building stuff, but at the same time, I think we also have the capacity to influence policy, and I think it would be great if we had a little bit more time to be able to do work like that.
Are there other questions from the audience?
I think it's still like in these questions about what happens after in projects like Lent space and even the holding pattern, that you had the idea of like how the connection of the community happens through these trees or objects or furniture, and then these things will be, this connection would still happen when these things will be donated or like would spread out like after the project is kind of done. I wonder if you guys have still like a research of like, it's the interest of the research of the office and keep track of what happens next, like if it's part of like, are these objects being used, how the community is really using that, what happens next, like really happening next with these things that are spread around. So is it part of your research? What do you guys think?
Yeah,
yes, starting tomorrow.
Starting tomorrow. we have a photographer coming around. We have maybe a news station gonna document some of the process, and yeah, we made ties to these organizations ourselves. We made a lot of new friends. I mean, we have friends at the Ravenswood NORC and the Jacob Riis neighborhood settlement. We feel kind of at home in the neighborhood, and we care about these institutions. And just personally, I think we all do. So I can't imagine just severing our ties to these people. I mean, it's just a great group of people. So I imagine it won't be scientific necessarily, but we'll definitely keep tabs.
And we hope, I mean, like for example, with the Teamsters, like, you know, they're going to get a few pieces, but they also we're looking for sort of more help to how to organize everything, so not just like plunking everything down. And so I think we are really open to sort of continuing a sort of like a design dialogue with the groups. But yeah, I mean, we'll look on our website. We're definitely going to have like the before and after picture of all the sites. So no worries about that.
There's one more burning question in the audience.
Okay. I was just wondering about the fins. Was there any discussion about finding a future home for the fins, or was that always just going to be just pretty much the fins?
Yeah, you know, it's geotextile. It's used in landscaping. It's a landscaping material, and the plan was to give it to Parks Department, right?
Parks Department.
And they were, you know, happy to take it. Thing is, it totally fell apart. The people told us it's going to last around 3 months, and literally exactly to the day, 3 months after we install it, they just came down. And so, but we still have, since initially there were a lot more fins in the project, so we still have a lot of the material to hand over. The plan was to distribute it, but since it's made to be underground and it was up there in the sun, it just lasted for exactly the time of holding pattern minus 2 days.
A youthful mistake, perhaps.
Perhaps, yes. But one thing to just add that quickly is we were warned several times by a lot of the staff at MoMA PS1. The stuff's, you know, be careful, like, you know, don't promise things because the stuff's going to get trashed. You wait till you see, like, these drunk kids. They'll be throwing this stuff against the wall and, you know, jumping up and dancing on the ping pong tables. After the whole process, not a single piece of furniture got damaged. Everything, well, the foosball table was a little messed up, but we got another one.
That's also the cheapest foosball table.
we got a new one.
The money would have bought a nicer.
Yeah, we would have bought a nicer foosball table, but we did get another one for the Reese. But so I think that was so thrilling to just that. And I don't know if it had to do with the fact that you thought twice about like totally wrecking a ping pong table that's going to go to the high school, the Infotech high school down the street, because there was a little tag on it. Maybe that's just wishful thinking, but amazingly, everything's intact. Yeah. And we're putting little fixes on things today. But,
oh, did you? We can squeeze one more. The rules of.
Please just. Yeah.
Oh, you're asking us now.
Yeah, you can contaminate our oral history.
Fine.
Well, first of all, just quickly, kind of for the record, it's not true that there's no brief. It's just that the brief is so generic that you actually do have to invent a brief within a very limited number of requirements. And one thing changed in 2009, which is people are encouraged but not required to think about issues of recycling, sustainability, and the like. So that was actually, and that was called out in 2009 as a change. But my question for you is, now that it's like 24 hours before the end, what, if you could change anything about the program, what would it be? All the more since I don't know that it's well known, but the winners every year not only build the project, but they also join the list of nominators in the subsequent years. Anyway, if you could change one thing at any stage from I would like a brief or whatever, other than I would like to fire so and so at.
That's a good one.
I don't mean if you could rewrite what happened to you in the last 4 months, but I mean if you anything about the program that you feel now as, you could say, alumni of it.
Seems to be pretty good.
Let's try now. We're looking over your. I'll ad lib until you guys can answer it. Sometimes you can answer it. But we were looking at your project in relation to the rest of them, and it's actually super radical if you look at your project versus a lot of the other years. So I think you are kind of taking a stance about what's important in this kind of project. And the way that we have been starting to talk about the brief between us in our interior conversation is it kind of snowballs throughout time. So each year the brief gets inflected or changed. And I think that your project is a definite inflection, both in that it raises a lot of expectations in the community about what the summer warm-up series should be, but also it is engaged in the community and also the second life of all the materials in a way that isn't always the case for the Young Architects Program. So I think you might not have to answer the question. It might be implied in your project, but maybe in the time that I'm talking about it.
I think it works really well. I mean, I think that the flexibility is really good, and I think that it, I think it would be a real pity to sort of have these kinds of sort of cumulative lessons added to it. The projects are out there, and so I hope that the people whoever win this upcoming year, of course it sort of reflects what happened before, but I hope they cover territory that we've never thought of, and I hope that doesn't sound like a sort of a silly, sort of a response, but I think we really had, of course we had our moments, but I think it was a very positive experience, and it was because there was kind of this openness for the project. I mean, no one ever said to us along the way, oh, you can't do that, or you can't do this, and I think that was really very empowering.
And maybe to add to that, and to the thought that the previous winners are defining the range or somewhat a stand-in for the very short brief. Actually, the courtyard itself is just, we really got to love a lot. The initial was 96 Frederick Fisher architecture. It's just such a fantastic background, even though we were a little bit, somewhat disturbed by the, Osama bin Laden compound look from afar of this thing, but it's just such an amazing quality of work, and there's so many wonderful details that inform the daily work of putting this thing together, but also the design, obviously. It's such a great setting for an experimental project, right? So many little nooks that you can hook into, literally.
I have one small idea. The jury was so amazing, and as Georgene suggested, the comments were so just intelligent and right on. But have you ever thought about bringing someone from the Community Board 2 onto the jury, or or just maybe every year it's like a different person from the neighborhood, like a guy from Checker. We have a long list of people in the neighborhood, and I think it could be interesting to just have a completely local, perspective.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting idea. Thank you. I mean, I'll think about it. Because like all suggestions about it, you have to think about the consequences and what in the end it is. I think there was a program up here I didn't attend, but Andres had come to at one point, and somebody said, well, why don't you publish the lists of the nominators? So we did, so we discussed it at great length and thought, should we do that? Is that a good idea, et cetera? Which is why I don't answer immediately, because when I thought about it at great length, I thought, no, actually, we should not. People should not be, suddenly subjected to, and I'm sorry I revealed your identity, but anyway, to being campaigned. They should really sort of send in the name that they think. So every time I hear a suggestion, it's like I really process it and think about what it would mean. I'll just say one last thing, which I think is extremely interesting in what you said. I think it's both, what I think you really did with the holding pattern motif is to underscore the fact that during the day, it's not an artistic installation alone, it's also a public park. So that is really, that I think is a radical thing you did. But then if people weren't, the other thing I think was wonderful in your presentation is to insist on the view of the building from outside, which is extremely rare in the history of the representation of the project. So it's always internalized in this courtyard, and so, so if you didn't know about that attitude of the wall and bringing in people from the other side of the wall, then you would look at Urban Beach, you would look at all of the things that have wading pools for kids during the day and that have park-like elements, because there is a history of park-like elements for daytime activities and not simply a setting for, dancing and music and drinking. But I really think that that's why your graphic is really most emblematic of the radical new thing you brought to it.
Well, I think we're going to let everybody off the hook there. Thank you very much to Georgene, Tobias, and Dan. And we've still got a lot more to talk about, so you'll be hearing from us. We only started to scratch the surface. Thank you all for coming on a Monday night. And I think we're done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.